Seems the rain is back again. But that's okay, 'cause we've got good stories and good company here on Cozy Horror with yours truly, Dr. Plague. It's so nice to get to spend some time with you guys in the morning as we read some great stories and have some wonderful times. So, let's get right into it, shall we? Let's start today's stories off with a popular tale by a great writer named J. Group. It's about a dark secret held by one of this country's greatest institutions. That's right, I'm talking about the Walt Disney vehicle that is Disney. So sit back, make yourself a little hot cocoa, and let's learn a little bit about Disney's terrible secret. Teddy and I had been working at Disney for years. The two of us had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of young cast members come and go, heading off to college or to better jobs and brighter futures. Meanwhile, the two of us stuck around and became a running joke to some of the younger employees, since we were never promoted to management, that is. Most of the lower-level members were young, in their early 20s or late teens, and to them, it was just a part-time gig, a way to raise money for college or to pass a bit of time until their real lives and careers began. But Teddy and I were lifers, and some would say losers, although I would never attach that label to myself willingly. I'd heard it whispered enough times to know that it was what other people thought of us. We'd both been there for nearly 2 decades, and had worked on pretty much every single attraction, but had never been deemed responsible enough to be promoted to supervisor status. Over all that time, I found a lot of secrets about the place. Some things that are known to the public, but also some revelations that aren't talked about anywhere. Did you know that cast members who work as mascots have to wear communal underwear? Yeah, that's right. They all share the same underoos, and they get washed in between uses. At least, in theory. Who knows what pervert came up with that idea? Or how about the fact the skeleton on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride was originally constructed out of real bones? Despite the park's insistence that all the bones were removed, a few still remain. Management lost track of which were real and which were fake, and they just left the real ones in there along with the imposters. But when you're up close, it's easy to tell them apart. The real ones are a little more yellow, and they're heavier than the plaster ones. There are plenty of morbid secrets like that. People scatter the ashes of their deceased loved ones in the park so frequently, we actually have a not-so-subtle code name for it, a white powder alert. The Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean are the most common places, but it's done all over, and who knows how often people get away with it without even being noticed. Code 101 means a ride is temporarily shut down, while Code V, or a protein spill, means that someone has vomited on a ride and it needs to be cleaned up. Those spills are often the cause of ride shutdowns, rather than mechanical issues. Oh, and if you hear yourself or someone else being referred to as a treasured guest, it doesn't mean you're a VIP. It's actually our code word for saying you're being an asshole. There are stories of ghosts, some told by people who never believed in such things before witnessing them in the park. The specter of Walt Disney himself has been seen a couple of times, outside Sleeping Beauty's castle, just on the other side of the drawbridge. Or sometimes he's seen at night, just outside his old apartment on Main Street, where occasionally you might smell a whiff of cigarette smoke, despite the fact that such things are banned inside the park. Walt and his family once lived there, so they could spy on visitors and listen to their opinion on the park. They would eavesdrop on their conversations from the second-floor apartment, just above the street level. George, a dead electrician, supposedly haunts the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and every morning, cast members must call out, "Good morning, George," at the start of the day. Otherwise, the ride will mysteriously have issues all day long. Unexpected shutdowns and other strange things often occur, if George isn't given his proper morning greeting. And have you heard about the animatronics and It's a Small World running all night long? Yep, those rumors are true too. In fact, quite a few of the lifelike robots stay in motion 24/7, even throughout the lockdown and park shutdowns a couple of years back. If you ask the management about it, they'll tell you it's because the attractions are cheaper to maintain that way. They break down less frequently if they're in constant motion. That's the excuse we get anyway. But I've come to realize there might be far more terrifying reasons for this. Something so disturbing and twisted that I wouldn't have thought it was possible if I hadn't witnessed it for myself. Teddy and I were on our lunch break when we found the storage room. We were looking for somewhere a little more private since Teddy had brought a bit of homemade greenery and his favorite piece of glassware that day. The park has miles and miles of tunnels crisscrossing beneath it, and Teddy and I had explored most of the labyrinth over our years of service. Like everything else in the park, there was a stupid nickname for these underground tunnels. They had been dubbed utilidors by some management types in the distant past. Most of the cast members just called them the tunnels, and they were so vast we often used golf carts to get from one end of them to the other. There were odd dead ends at some of the tunnels that seemed to intentionally lead to nowhere. We were currently in one such useless utilidor when we noticed an odd-looking door which appeared to be at least half a century old, if not more. It had a rusted placard hanging over its surface which read, "Obsolete Animatronic Storage." "Hey, didn't there used to be a vending machine there?" Teddy asked. "Who cares? Let's see if it opens. We've only got 20 minutes left," I said, looking at the time on my cell phone. The doorknob turned in my hand, and the two of us went inside. I looked for a light switch on the wall to my right, but I didn't find one. It was pitch black and impossible to see anything. Using the flashlight on my phone, I cast a beam of light around the room, trying to see what kind of space we were in. There were people-shaped forms all around us, draped in tarps and tablecloths. The room was as long as a football field, but it was narrow, only about 15 feet across. "Creepy," Teddy said, taking the words right out of my mouth. "Well, I guess it did say this was animatronic storage. This must be really old." He wandered away from the door, and it clicked shut behind him. Something about that made me nervous, but I had ignored the feeling. The door had been unlocked, and that meant we'd be able to get out again. Still, I reached for the knob to check it. My hand was about to touch the polished brass when Teddy called out, making me jump. "Whoa! Check this out!" he said, sounding excited. I left the door, turning around to see what he was looking at. He had his cell phone light on as well, and was lifting up one of the tarps to look at what was underneath. "Man, this thing's freaky looking." He pulled the tarp away, and I saw what he meant. The thing hidden beneath was very creepy. It had the goateed face of a young man, but the ears and nubby horns of a goat, looking far too real. Its lower half looked like it also belonged to a goat. The thing reminded me of a satyr, those drunken, lustful half-goat gods from Greek mythology. I tried to figure out why it was making me feel so uneasy, and realized it was the eyes. They were too lifelike, far more real than the animatronics out in the park, and the look of the skin, the way it reflected the light and anything about it, it looked like it was a real creature. More likely, a man had been sewn to the body of a goat in a very thorough way, making the seams blend together perfectly. Teddy was already moving on to the next one, looking under another tarp. He left me alone with this one, and I looked back down at it as I let go of the cover and let it fall across its face again. Flinching backwards, I nearly screamed, as I could have sworn the eyes of the thing were looking at me, just as I dropped the tarp over its face. My heart was beating fast, and I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or that the eyes had been looking up that way the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. "We need to go," I heard myself say, but Teddy wasn't listening. "Holy crap! This one's even more jacked up. Dude, you gotta check this out." I opened my mouth to say, "No, let's get out of here." But my words caught in my throat. The satyr creature under the tarp was clearly moving now. Its head was still draped in the plastic sheet, but I could see it turning to look at me, as if its gaze could penetrate through the tarp. "Dude, come check this out," Teddy was yelling, pulling the next sheet off and dropping it to the floor. I saw what he was referring to, my eyes drawn to it despite the terror of the draped creature just in front of me. This one was tall, standing nearly 10 feet. It had one large eye instead of two. Man, whoever made these things was tripping on acid or something. Look at this thing. It looks like they jacked an eye from an elephant and stuffed it in some dude's forehead. I think they were trying to make a cyclops. I could barely hear him, as now the thing in front of me wasn't the only figure in the room which was moving. To my left, the entire row of covered forms were beginning to stretch and turn as they woke up from whatever sleep they had been in. Some were tall, some were short, like the satyr thing on my right, but all of them were alive. I realized it was very cold all of a sudden, and realized I could see my breath steaming out in the air. A compressor groaned to life, and I saw a nearby vent cough out a frosty plume as if something had been jammed or broken and was suddenly operating again. The temperature in the room began to plummet, and a second later, I was freezing cold, the rushing air chilling the back of my neck. Finally, I was shocked out of my stupor and managed to get a word out. "Teddy," I croaked, but too late. The giant cyclops hand shot out and grabbed my friend by the throat. It lifted him up into the air while his legs kicked and his arms thrashed, trying to break its grip. He was choking and sputtering, flailing madly as he tried to free himself. The cyclops firmly held him by the throat, and I heard the sound of cartilage and bones being crushed. His spine popped, and his head bent back at an impossible angle, his skull lolling backwards like a broken Pez dispenser. And then the giant dropped him to the concrete floor of the room, and his phone clattered and turned over, casting half the room in darkness again. I backed away, feeling like I was moving in slow motion, but unable to go any quicker. Reaching back for the doorknob, it felt like the tunnel had grown by 100 feet. It was further away than it could possibly have ever been. I kept backing up, taking slow, quiet steps. The figures were moving towards me, all of them closing the gap and slowly walking in my direction. Their forms were covered, draped in bed sheets and tarps and tablecloths, as if this place had been thrown together in a hurry, hastily constructed to house these possessed animatronics or whatever these creatures were. Cold air was filling the room, making it even more difficult to move. My skin felt like it was being stabbed with pins and needles, the freezing wind going right through my summer clothes. There was a sound of tearing flesh and blood being spilled. I looked to see several of the monsters were tearing the skin from Teddy's face, peeling it from his bones with some difficulty, like trying to open an underripe orange. The worst part was, it looked like he was still alive. He was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, his eyes wide open as if he'd be screaming if he were capable of it. I tried to tear my eyes away from it, but I couldn't. I found myself staring at him as they took the flesh off his face. I backed up hard into something and realized it was the door. In the darkness, I felt for the doorknob behind me, but I couldn't find it. The creatures were still moving towards me, all of their faces covered by sheets except for the massive cyclops that had killed my friend. Its one huge eye was fixed on me, and as it moved in lockstep with the other creatures, they all seemed to share one hive mind. As they approached, a few stepped on each other's coverings, tearing them away and revealing their hideous faces. I saw a woman's upper body sewn onto the legs of a deer, and a man with the hindquarters of a bull, their faces full of mute anger. My hand groped for the doorknob desperately, and after several long moments, it settled on the smooth brass. It was so cold, almost frozen. I spun around, expecting the doorknob to turn easily, This time it was stuck. I couldn't tell if it was locked or frozen solid, but either way it wouldn't budge. Feeling like there would be icy hands around my throat at any second, I was too terrified to turn around. I heard the sound of shuffling feet moving closer, the icy wind blowing through my clothes and raising goosebumps on my skin. I began pounding against the door with my fists, banging on it as hard as I could as I screamed for help, pleading for someone to save me. "Help! Help! Open the door!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. The corridor we had entered was a dead end, rarely used by anyone. Of course, this door would be locked from the inside, I thought to myself. Who would offer an escape to these animatronic demons? If they had ever been imbued with any form of failsafe, it was long ago out of commission and useless. These creatures had no mercy and no respect for human life. They wanted blood and flesh and meat to create more of themselves, to raise an army of undead robotic soldiers. Manic thoughts were racing through my head as I tried to think of another way out. There had to be something, some other way out. I turned around, hoping for some other exit to present itself, but instead I just saw hundreds of shrouded forms stepping closer and closer until they were just a few feet away. A gurgling, wheezing sound could be heard from behind them, and I realized it was the labored breathing of Teddy slowly dying. If I didn't get out of here, I'd be next. With one desperate move, I kicked out towards the head of the nearest shrouded figure. It was the satyr. My foot connected with his face, and as it did, the entire crowd fell back a step, as if hurting one of them would hurt all of them. I lashed out with another blow, punching it in the gut, and the crowd took another wounded step backward. I used the newfound space to my advantage and took a short running start towards the door. Kicking it hard with my boot, I connected squarely with the spot beyond the doorknob. It rattled in the frame, but it didn't budge. Taking a quick look back over my shoulder, I saw the crowd of animatronic creatures were coming at me again with renewed anger. They looked furious at me for assaulting one of them, and apparently I had injured it. The satyr was slumped forward, its joints making creaky noises as it made its way towards me, its movements jerky and disorganized. I kicked the door again, harder this time, using every ounce of force I could muster. I heard something splinter and break, but it still wouldn't budge. Icy hands grabbed my throat from behind, and I threw an elbow backward to try to break free. It connected with whatever had grabbed me, and it didn't let go. Instead, its grip tightened, choking and squeezing my throat until I couldn't breathe. I let out another strangled cry for help, but no sound came out this time. The grip on my windpipe was making it impossible to call out. My feet were going numb from the cold, which seemed to have intensified even more somehow. I hadn't thought it was possible to feel any colder, but I realized that whoever was controlling the temperature of this place was doing this on purpose. These things didn't like the cold, and it put them in a state of hibernation. For some reason, this place had been almost room temperature when we entered, bringing these creatures back to life. With one more desperate effort, I lifted my leg and kicked as hard as I could, my heel connecting with the door just beside the latch. Something shattered and broke loudly, and the door swung open on its hinges. The momentum brought me forward, and I found myself tumbling back into the corridor. Whatever had grabbed hold of me came with me, the icy hand still around my neck. As I landed, the thing's fingers broke off like icicles, shattering on impact. The shrouded creature was writhing on the floor, looking as if it wanted to get up and chase me, but wasn't quite capable of it yet. It was still too cold. I stumbled to my feet and ran from there, not really thinking about my mistake until I was far past that point. When it occurred to me what I had done, it was too late. I had let those things out. I'd opened the door and freed them, and I had allowed the warm air inside so they could come back to life and escape. I was too terrified to stay in the park. I went home immediately without saying a word to anyone, then called my boss and told him I was sick with a stomach flu. I apologized, saying I'd been throwing up in the bathroom and didn't want to cause a code V while on stage. He told me that was okay, since he knew I was a dedicated employee, trusted cast member who had been with the park for years. But he did ask if I'd seen Teddy, and I had to lie and tell him I hadn't. Supposed to go back to work tomorrow, for the first time since all of this happened. The worst part about it, nobody has reported Teddy missing. His family hadn't called to say anything either. It's almost like none of it ever happened. Except I've got the marks around my neck, the bruises that prove I didn't imagine it. I just got a strange message from Teddy on his cell phone. He says, "See you at work tomorrow, buddy," accompanied by a mouse emoji. Me and some of the cast members have a big surprise for you. Some of you may recognize the musical selection with that one from another longtime contributor to the horror medium. Though he's not a narrator, many of us grew up listening to the musical selections of Mew, and he's just added so much to this genre that I feel I'd be remiss not giving him a shout-out. It certainly wouldn't be the same story without the haunting themes of It's a Small World playing in the background. So, moving along, let's get another great story by the author JoJo, while we hear about a realtor who dabbles mostly in haunted houses. Ever since I was little, death was a next-door neighbor. I mean, literally right next door. I could look out the window and see it. I could watch through my bedroom window as Mom walked towards it. Every day, she would wake up before the sun and make her brisk walk to work. It took me a long time to discover what she did, and even longer to understand it. She would pry bodies apart and put them back together, prettier than they were when they arrived. They arrived in dark vans, bruises all over their bodies, and they would leave with eyeliner and makeup. That's where I learned that one can measure life in shades of purple, whether it be bruises or makeup. Measured, mind you, not defined. So naturally, that's where I saw my first body. I'd try to sneak in now and then, and I guess I was never successful. Mom always thwarted me, but eventually, I just wore her down. It was too much being the mortician and the security guard. So there he was, a fairly innocent death. He looked so natural, but just a little less. I always thought I would take after Mom, and for a while I was on track to. I'm not even sure how I got sidetracked. I enjoyed making Mom's job look nice. She always kept it so dour, and I had wanted to spruce up the place. I felt fulfilled when it all came together, and I felt like I normally do, just a little more. I did it for my house, then I did it for my mom, my friends, my neighbors, and before I even knew what was happening, I was trying to convince people to buy a house. My houses sold, and people took notice of how I put them together. I guess, if I were to be poetic, that's how I took after Mom. I took these houses, the remains of them, and dolled them up as best I knew how. I made it look nice. So nice that you'd never know it was dead at all. For a long time, I thought that when people died, that was it. No ghosts, no heaven or hell. It was a snap, and you were just gone. Like a house. When the furnace goes out, when the walls rot away, and the spider webs consume every window, I thought the house was gone. I know now that's wrong. Despite working with my mom for many years, I never entertained the notion of ghosts. It wasn't until the house on Wilbur Street that I changed my mind. I won't go into too much detail, but that house was its own beast. And if it weren't for a strange but generous buyer, it might have been the end of my career. It was a weed, though, something that sprouted in me, unwelcome but beautiful nonetheless. A world you might not have ever heard of. A world that probably, if not for what I'm telling you now, you would likely go your whole life without knowing about. In the housing market, there exists a small but dedicated sect reserved for the enigmatic influential, or even the nefarious. I'm talking about the buying and selling of houses that have, in one way or another, been deemed haunted. Just like any realtor, I'll get my hands on a house sometimes. Sometimes I find it myself, sometimes it's offloaded by a larger realty company. Regardless, I'll go in, make the house look as nice as possible, just like I would with any other house. That was before I discovered this unofficial and morbid market. Unlike an unafflicted house, however, I would research and experiment. With enough research, I can gather information on who perished within the house and the cause of death. I also need to be mindful of people who lived in the home but had relocated, as spirits can travel back to where their emotions were the strongest, like a magnet pulling in metal sand. After gathering the information, I conduct my small experiments. The severity and nature of the haunting need to be distinguished and defined before I can even list the house. Something you might not know about most hauntings is how consistent they are. Sure, the activity will alter, but it will happen over and over. I've had houses you could set a stopwatch by. I use a marker to outline cups and dishes in order to check if they've been pushed. I take pictures of each room every hour, on the hour, so I can meticulously comb through them. Something you may or may not know about typical hauntings is they can be boring. Rarely do you come across an outwardly aggressive home. And when you do, the type of people that buy those, it's not my place, but it's troubling to think about what they might want the home for. That's neither here nor there, though. Haunted homes sell to many people. You have eccentrics and ghost hunters who want a place for entertainment. There are people who practice the dark arts, though you can typically sniff out the wannabe types. There are even people who just really need a home and try to get a cheaper deal. Depending on the haunting and its interest, sometimes they do. You have to call it a loss at some point and lower the price just below market value. That's how you do it. That's what this house was, I thought. Another suburban home I was going to take a hit on. Boy, was I wrong. Of course, that's how tales like these come to be. If I was right, if all I ever saw was a coffee mug move across the counter, then you'd never hear a peep out of me. The house was on Carter Avenue. If you don't know which Carter Avenue out of the hundreds that likely exist, then yes, you're not meant to. I got it for a bargain from my peer because, well, it was a house that nobody had high expectations for. There wasn't a history of violence or any mention of the occult, just a younger couple that passed away in their sleep. Carbon monoxide leak. To me, though, the house was lovely, if not for a small string of reported activity. The house could have been sold on its merits. It was in a quiet neighborhood. Everything looked new and had been taken care of. It was a picture of suburban living. So I hedged my bets and thought I would just make the house look like a proper home for anyone looking to buy. It took a while, an uncomfortable amount of time, before I'd got a bite. While I toiled away, looking through photos of the house's bedroom, my phone buzzed. It was a buyer. A young couple looking to buy their first home. The woman on the phone beamed about starting a family of their own. So we set up a date to meet, and I plunged further into Carter Avenue. As bizarre as it is to say, I wanted to make sure the haunting was child-friendly. No loud noises or aggressive movements, you understand. For the most part, though, the house was quiet. Sure, there were signs, but the haunting was so mellow, you'd never know it if you weren't looking for it. A slight push that would move a cup from its outline. Pictures on the wall that would go askew, and a penny was even pushed off the counter. That was all, so, just enough. It was just enough activity for it to make the difference between haunted and natural occurrence. Maybe I should have had my wits about me in that regard. Though I know, when I offer myself grace, there's no way I could have known it was anything other than a run-of-the-mill haunting. The day of the showing plays in my head from time to time. I always go back to when I was starting down the hall. It was right before the couple was supposed to show up. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. It led to all the bedrooms and had light bleeding in from each. The sun was gentle and warm. It created a vignette in the hall. At the end of the hall there was a picture hanging above a small table, decorated with various books and a small fern. The picture was an oil painting, a stark mixture of black and white. Upon seeing it initially, you'd assume it was nonsense, a Rorschach test of sorts. If you took the time to soak it in, though, at least for me, I made out the picture. It almost always looked like an animal with a wide-open jaw, a howl of anguish. Once I made out the mouth, the rest followed suit. Maybe the face was meant to be beautiful, but it looked straight out of hell to me. It felt crooked. It, however, was a painting in the home that the haunting hadn't affected. To the naked eye, the painting was perfectly straight, lined right up to the surface of the table under it, but it felt crooked. I could feel the painting making one side of my head heavier, craning my neck as if trying to see it from a new angle. The hall itself felt as though it was stretching out, pulling the details of the painting further and further away from me. The once warm vignette ignited from the room, turning into static with the tunnel. So it shouldn't come as a shock when I say I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the front door shut. My arms rushed to my chest as if guarding me from an incoming attack. Even without my hands actually on my skin, I could feel my heart smacking around inside. A few breaths in and out calmed me, and I gathered my senses. I quickly rushed down the stairs and spotted the couple, Sandra and Owen Welling. The door had startled me, but I'd informed them upon their arrival that they could just come in, as the house wasn't exactly booked for tours. Bounding down the stairs, I immediately started in with the pleasantries. They looked as normal as can be. The woman was a blonde, her hair just barely touching her shoulders. The man looked tired, almost like he had headed straight to the home from work. His brown hair haphazardly swooped to one side. I couldn't help but notice he was sheepish, letting the woman take the lead and speaking up very little. Admittedly, this annoyed me. They were a couple, and while every dynamic is different, I found it odd that he had so little interest in where he might build a family. It happened, though, and swung both ways. Suppose it's nothing more than a pet peeve, but it did inform me to pay more attention to the wife. So, with her trailing closely behind me, we toured the lower floor. It felt almost like it used to, showing off regular homes. The activity in the house was so sparse that I'd rarely stop to talk about it. In the kitchen, I informed them that it's best to leave cups and dishes a respectful distance from the edge. In the dining room, I informed them that sometimes they could hear a knocking on the floor above. The knocking noise was not audible from anywhere else in the house, which is probably the most peculiar haunt in the home, but it's harmless. She asked questions here and there, but it wasn't until we began to ascend the stairs that she started delving deeper. In the first bedroom, she asked me who the previous occupants had been. I told her it was a young couple, though I only knew their names. We sometimes find photos left behind by the previous occupants, but this time, especially with younger folks, the families affected will snatch up photos before I even get my hands on the house. It might seem odd that I don't go too deep into the lives of those who are supposedly haunting the grounds. I did early on. I'd familiarize myself with their faces and history, but I found that doing so would cause a confirmation bias. I would see faces where there might not have been one, or I'd pick up smells related to the previous death and assume it was paranormal, when it could just be a clogged drain. The woman stalled for a moment and rested her hand on the doorframe. I could only see her back. The sun beaming through the windows wrapped a glow around her thin figure. "It's cold." I hardly heard the words when she spoke them. They were distant, like they were afraid to leave the room. She was right, though. It was cold, and noticeably so. The house was monitored for temperature variations, but nothing so severe. The skin on my arms prickled. I thought the cold would have made me shiver, but after taking in the new chill, I realized my pocket was buzzing. I ignored it, realizing the man had drifted out of sight, though only barely. He stood in the hall, looking at the same painting that had mesmerized me earlier. "This would make a great nursery," the woman said, her voice louder this time, but still distant. I was watching the man, though, his arms sheepishly jostling from side to side like he was fidgeting with something. A tension had built in my chest, partially from the cold gripping my lungs. Reaching into my pocket, I quickly retrieved the phone, intending to ignore the call as the vibrating was audible. "Oh, absolutely. It's great for sunlight in the mornings," I replied, glancing at her as I spoke. I glimpsed the same silhouette before returning to my phone's touchscreen, and just like the painting had before, the illuminated screen stole my attention. I couldn't have been more than a minute, though. Despite how long it felt, the clock in the upper right corner didn't change. An incoming call. The sensation of the phone rattling in my hand acted as a warning bell, a siren of things to come. Incoming call from Sandra Wellings. The words couldn't have felt heavier in my hands. Her voice, when I picked up the phone, couldn't have been louder in my head. I listened to the woman on the other line apologizing. She was embarrassed. They had fallen asleep on the couch and had no alarm set. She was asking me if they could still come by or if I wanted to reschedule. A reply, no matter how desperate I was for it, did not come, and as Sandra continued bidding for my attention, I could only look down the stretching hallway. In the deserted hallway, the only object present was the small white plastic dish and 2 batteries lying nearby. Suddenly, I became horrendously aware of the figure that was in the doorway. I couldn't see her as I started down the hall, but God, could I feel her. Her presence felt so stifling, I thought I might fall through the floor. A soft whimper of denial weaseled its way up my throat. It felt like I was being told a story, or rather, it felt like a story I'd already known, but that had been pushed deep down. This was someone else's story, a story of a death much more sinister than the public knew. This would be a great room for a nursery, the figure spoke, and as if those words manifested, I could feel strands of hair drop on the side of my face. She must have been as tall as she felt, hunched over with her head pressed against the ceiling, dark strands hanging like stalagmites. She wanted me to look. I could feel it. Her gaze fixed on me and burned holes through my scalp. Closer and closer, I could feel her warm breath wafting on the side of my face. The smell was more noticeable, though, or rather the lack thereof. I could only watch the painting, the hallway, once again tunneling as I pondered if it was safer to look at her or ignore her. Hauntings could get bad. Yes, even this bad. I've experienced little myself, but this wasn't my first time, though my heart still bumped like it was. When the retching began, the decision to focus on the hallway became one that I picked. A guttural and whining scrap lurched from the woman, though. It sounded like pulling marbles down from metal tubing, and after a moment, something spilled from her mouth. I could hear small thuds smacking the ground, one after another. Once again, the sound reminded me of marbles. Then she was gone. I released the breath that had been held down as her weight lifted off me, allowing my skin to loosen. Looking down, they were all splayed out at my feet. They must have rolled around quite a bit after hitting the floor. A portrait drawn with AA batteries, a tale of heartbreak, scored by the chiding of a baby. A soft whine, much softer than the woman's. That room really does get so much sun. It had rested such a lovely glow on the crib inside. I could hear the baby crying from within it. I'm sure I could have heard it from anywhere in the house. It was ethereal, something I couldn't escape. It echoed through the walls and bounced around the room as I took my first step inside. The batteries around my feet shuffled aside and rolled, clattering against one another. A game of electric billiards. The sound of the baby crying became less defined with each step I took, its cries being pulled further through the veil. The white wooden slats of the crib ceased to be an obstacle, and I could peek over the edge. I didn't intend to step further. The bile was already churning. The sides of the crib acted like a dam for the wet, sticky mess inside. All that white was painted freshly red, a crimson that glistened in the sun. My legs gave out, and I crashed to the floor. The hardwood vibrated on impact. I felt my throat choke and scratch. Burning came afterwards in intervals. It was getting air, never catching my breath. A burning rose in my chest, nails dragging. Looking down at my shirt, I could see long, dark lines running along my skin, like aged scratch marks. "I'm sorry," I whispered, cowardly, pensive. Looking up, he was lying on the floor, the boyfriend, the man. He was clawing at his chest, and his body writhed. The veins in his eyes crept towards the pupils like vines. His eyes rolled up, his gaze reached far above his head. This mess of a man, he was watching her, so scared of her now. She was looming over me again. All her hate and grief sat like a ball in my neck. All her unbridled horror wrapped around me, and I felt it. I could feel the hot, stinging tears running down my cheek. All that horror, waking up in the middle of the night, feeling how weak your body is. She must have known, or maybe she saw him taking them out. He probably told her he was replacing them. A depth of despair I could only understand when I looked into her eyes. Dying, knowing the life inside of you would follow. I thought truly that her face would be horrific, a mangled mess of bones and flesh, red and pulse. Horrific indeed, but there was no blood, just tears. The streams disobeying gravity. They twisted around her face and slipped around the curves of her nose. Her very own soul, a Rorschach. Pain will paint our lives. It can shape the way we see things. It can change the feeling of a room. It can haunt the memories you once held dear. No matter how many times you try to paint over that pain, it's still there. And I felt it on my face that day, as a few of her tears relented, failing to mix with mine. I knew her more intimately than I knew myself. That's the real ghost. And I suppose it always will be. The pain. We locked eyes, and although I understood her, the fear did not subside. A part of me felt like if I moved, she would change. If I broke off the conversation, as it were, then I would see something worse. The pain was a mask, and I could feel whatever was under it was in torment. I still think about it sometimes. The man was there in all his horror, face beet red and swollen, his throat ravaged with claw marks as he gasped for air, feeling as though he was being suffocated, regretting the decision he had made, probably telling himself in his final moments that he could have just left, and he was right. Of course, he likely died thinking of himself, and that was a moment of solace for me, that in his last thoughts he realized just how stupid he was. Even as I heard his body writhe around, pudders of liquid spilling from his mouth, even as he smacked the floor with what little strength he had left, begging for mercy, I watched his face. long and black, curtain-like strands of hair cutting off my peripherals, so all I could see was her. I stared into her face, dread growing closer. My eyes started to lose focus as she looked down at me. Her face appeared to stretch away from me like it was retreating down a hallway. She moved further and further, the guttural sound from before echoing around the column of hair she created. It got louder, growing as she shrank. Before too long, her face appeared like a two-dimensional object in the distance, just her misery, hanging solitary in a museum. At that distance, the noise was suffocating. A chirp layered on top of 1,000 other chirps until I couldn't stand it anymore, and my eyelids slammed shut. The noise halted then, and quiet returned. My breathing was deep and ragged, and after wrestling with the thought, I opened my eyes again. Staring down the hallway, I felt the phone in my pocket buzz. Reaching into it, I read that Sandra was trying to get a hold of me again. Only 3 minutes had passed since she called. Accepting the call, I heard her rambling. I only focused on what she was saying when she asked if I was showing other people around. The words came out before I thought about how to phrase them. I just asked, "Did you hear her too?" Sandra chimed that she had, but hung up when the baby started crying, as it was hurting her ears. She continued talking as I zoned out, hypnotized by the hallway once again. "The house isn't a fit for you." I cut her off, cold and direct. "This house was no place to raise a baby. Someone will buy it, but I won't sell it. Damn shame, too. The light coming in through the window at the end of the hall really livens up the place." Man, listen to that rain out there. It's really coming down. I guess that'll be good for the frogs that are coming back out for spring, though. You can hear them out there if you really listen. They're croaking up a storm. I'm surprised it's not coming over the mic. Let's go on from realtors to the hellacious nature of airports. In this story by John C. Mack, we'll find out about the problems of being stuck in Hell's airport. I don't have much time, so if things sound a little weird, just bear with me. This is a warning. If you see black clouds at all, just run. Doesn't matter where you are. I don't know if this thing is spreading. I'm getting ahead of myself. On April 5th, my wife and I took off for a wedding in Vermont. Before we left, we heard the news talk about a big northeastern storm that's going to drop a bunch of snow and ice. Even though it looks like we're going to be okay since our plane is landing technically in New Hampshire, just south of the storm. The flight was 2 hours, but about halfway through the trip, the clouds started to change color. Not gray like you'd expect. Darker. More like black. Looking more like volcanic ash clouds than normal storm clouds. My wife was busy playing her Nintendo Switch, but since I was laid off, I had a lot on my mind. I was a little surprised that nobody else noticed it, but off in the distance, I could have sworn I saw something move in the distance. It was hard to tell. It sort of looks like a wing swooping through the clouds, like a fish that makes 180s at the surface. The pressure wake pushed the clouds outward, like something was coming and then changed its mind. It had to be a trick of the eye, probably. It had to be the sun hitting and reflecting away off the ash clouds. I shouldn't have been assuming they were ash clouds, but time proved me right. The pilot never made any announcement, and I didn't really see anything either, so I kept my mouth shut. Maybe if I hadn't, things would have turned out different for Courtney. When I looked away, I happened to catch one of the flight attendants staring at her. Her head slightly tilted, and she wouldn't take her eyes off of me. It sounds strange, but it felt like she was waiting to see if I was about to tell my wife what I had seen. I decided to keep looking busy and even decided to shut my eyes for a few minutes, thinking she had just seen something might distract the old veteran stewardess's attention. It had to be about 10 minutes because I listened to my favorite song twice and another song before opening my eyes. And to my shock, she was still looking at me. Now, her teeth looked different, like she was trying hard to smile. I swear it looked like her gums were bleeding. I decided to get up and go to the bathroom, the one farthest from her. That must have done the trick, because when I came back, she had moved on to her normal duties of serving passengers. When I got back, my wife finally noticed the black clouds, but by this time we could barely see past the wing. Did the pilots see anything? Not wanting to worry her, I assured her they have all kinds of communications and radar. Even if they can't see in front of them, they know where they're going. She gave me a look. Courtney was like that. She could see right through me like an MRI machine. The fasten seatbelt sign came on, and with it, the pilot's voice. "Attention travelers, we'll be making our final descent momentarily. Please make sure all loose items are stored, as you won't be needing them." What's that mean? That was weird. I looked around, and thankfully, someone else, who I would shortly find out was our air marshal for the flight, stood up and headed for the cockpit, his face a mask of concern. He shut the drapes behind him, so no one could see him. I heard him knocking loudly and asking to be let in. Just then, the stewardess from earlier rushed by me, running against my arm. Suddenly, my arm was in drastic pain. I looked down, and it looked like someone had taken a cheese grater to it. My wife looked to try and help me. "Oh, God, are you okay? What happened?" I told her I wasn't sure and started pressing dirty paper towels and Skittles wrappers on my wound to stop the bleeding. My wife yelped for help. Other people started looking, and in the confusion, nobody else saw the air marshal struggling, except me, as he was pulled into the bathroom by the stewardess. Except she now looked more like a demon, with black scales on the forearms of her lethal hands and sharp claws. There was panic on the man's face, or maybe it was pain. I don't know. Just as the door shut, I could see the man's skin turning red as if it were being burned off by a torch, or whatever that thing pretending to be a stewardess was. Before I could tell anyone to look, the air marshal disappeared into the airplane bathroom. By this time, my wife had noticed my face and looked up front, but she didn't see anything. "Are you okay?" I tried to tell her something. It took the air marshal, but she just looked at me in confusion. And that was when the gunshot rang out in the cabin. The bullets began flying out of the bathroom from where the air marshal had been dragged. His screams were guttural. He must have gotten loose, but he never made it out. More bullets went off, and everyone scattered. Several shots hit the cockpit, and luckily they didn't penetrate the bulletproof door. Unfortunately, one of the bullets did shoot out the pressurized windows. The next few minutes were a blur. Everyone was panicking, and with no direction, everyone braced for the inevitable. I looked out the window just as we were about to hit. We were through the clouds, and what I was seeing wasn't New Hampshire. It looked like some kind of hellscape. Lava rivers and large mounds in the distance, horned monstrosities roaming the outskirts of the airport. The barbed wire fencing that lay more like fences made from rubber or skin, and the buildings were covered in ash and strange demonic symbols. After that, it was only blackness. I came to eventually, hanging and nearly falling out of my seat. I appeared to be only a few feet off the ground, and I was alone. My wife's seat was broken clean off. I can't see her, and I don't see anyone else living. I prepared myself and unlatched the seatbelt. I tucked and managed to save my 33-year-old ankles when I hit the ground. I stood up, letting my bearings hit me, when I finally got a look around and noticed there was no sun. It should have been there. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but it looks like midnight out there. Alone and scared, I tried calling out, but I was afraid to draw the attention of those giant monsters I'd seen just before the crash. Just then, I heard a girl screaming. Instinct kicked in, and I ran to help. I jumped over the debris and body parts from the passengers. All I could think was that it might be Courtney, and I had to do something. I rounded one of the plane engines that was on fire, and I wish I didn't see what I had witnessed next. An early 20s Gen Z girl covered in dirt, her face cut and badly bleeding. So bad I couldn't tell if she still had her eyes. But then the worst of it finally hit me when I realized what she was doing. She was feeling for her legs, or her lack thereof. She cried out, screaming for her mother, while she grabbed at the stumps of what had been her legs. I have to admit I was scared. I was in shock. How could I help her? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't let her suffer alone. I took a step when suddenly I heard another woman, but this one wasn't screaming. She was laughing. Suddenly, a beautiful, terrifying demon woman walked around the corner, and with her came two tiny crawling demons. "Oh, my child, save your screams. We're just getting started." With that, she snapped her fingers, and I watched as the demons tore into the poor girl. Her screams drew more of the demon dogs. "The more you despair, the more you will suffer. Embrace the suffering, and you will be released from it." The girl cried as best she could as the monster tore into her throat, but with one last breath, she must have gave her what the demon wanted. Suddenly, they were surrounded in black smoke and disappeared. The demon dogs, the demon woman, and the girl, all gone. I was left alone among the debris, the death, the ash-filled air. I didn't know what to do. I found a place to hide. I thought this was hell. Found out later, it wasn't. After having a breakdown under the debris of the crashed plane and still having no idea if my wife was even alive, I had this weird feeling that I had to keep going. It just kept saying, keep alive, keep moving. I can hear those demon dogs coming. I need to be fast. Sometime after my encounter, I heard something loud and deep. It was familiar somehow, though. It sounded like an engine, a plane. I ran through piles of debris and burning cars, planes, cruise ships, and buses. I got to the top of the debris mound just in time to see a 747 punch through the clouded barrier. This one landed just like it was supposed to. I looked up and noticed flying demons scattering as the plane hooked the terminal gate. Just then, the hundreds of demons surrounding the tarmac shrieked like they were welcoming something. Just then, from a shadowy hole in the ground, a giant snake erupted. The giant snake-like creature slithered around the plane like a boa constrictor, preparing to suffocate its prey. The doors opened, and immediately I could hear people screaming for their lives. I watched as a humanoid demon dressed like a pilot in a torn uniform, with random horns tearing its suit of skin off. It was like it was wearing a costume. It started throwing passengers off the plane. Demon dogs and other emaciated humanoid demon things began to swarm the passengers. A middle-aged man in a $5,000 suit, he screamed as the creatures tore his clothes off and he was carried into the main terminal. He swung his suitcase like a weapon. Just before he disappeared, one of the smallest humanoid demons jumped up and bit down on his wrist, stopping him from injuring any of the rest of them with that metal suitcase. I could hear him scream even louder, begging for help and to be let go. Before he vanished into the terminal, I saw the little demon tear the guy's hand off. Was that where they took Courtney, I wondered? I navigated my way inside. I don't know why. I put myself through these sights of something in me just kept demanding that I move forward. Like I had to see it. I watched as all the passengers from the plane, buses, the people who had just got lost on car rides ended up here. They were sorted onto paths that were surrounded by barbed wire. "Come on, you meat sacks, it's time to get sorted out. Which one of you is one of us, and which one of you is for the meat grinder?" One of the sick-looking demons with a sharp pike yelled at these poor souls, shuffling them through the giant rotating spikes, just like TSA instructing passengers to go through security. Demon guards pushed each person towards the front of the line, where a larger demon would look at each person to classify them. Aviation, infantry, necrotics, this one has spirit. Training pits, We'll beat that out of you, or we'll eat you. The guy looked like a soldier type. Broad shoulders, tattoos, looked like someone from a movie, with the army guys in Benghazi. One by one, people were chosen for roles in Hell's forces. As far as I can tell, there was a small percent of prisoners that the demons didn't want anything to do with, which I thought was pretty weird. Wouldn't everyone make a good soldier? I never got my answer. One of the flying demons landed near the ventilation duct I was hiding in, and I needed to sneak away. I made my way through the vents. To my relief, nothing was in there with me. At least nothing that ever found me. Eventually, I found my way to the airport authority office. It looked guarded. Several bear-type looking guys and big old demons that guarded the door. Using the vents, I quietly snuck in and found what appeared to be a map with some demon casting a spell over the airport. On the giant omnidirectional map, I could see a bubble around the airport. At first I thought it was hiding this place. Whatever that thing in the airport authority office is, it's how they're cloaking the airport, and the demons are building an army with our own people. I don't know how, but somehow in this office I have signal. Maybe it's how no one knows this place is gone. I don't know. I don't know anything up until an hour ago. I didn't even believe in hell. If anyone gets this message, you need to tell everyone about this demon cloaking this place. If it's something more than turning people into demons, I don't know, but we have to save these people. Every plane that lands is either adding more soldiers to the enemy ranks or enslaving more innocent souls. The worst part is, the planes are leaving. Who's on them? I don't know, but they can't be human. I'm going to keep exploring. I can't explain this feeling, but something is telling me that Courtney's not far. I'm going to find out as much as I can and come back here to relay what I can. This has to be the start of something. All this rain is starting to make me think about nap time, which, unfortunately for you guys, will be coming up here very soon, I think. Oh, but don't worry just yet. We're only halfway done, so let's move right on to another great story. There are lots of places, in my opinion, that it's probably not a good idea to bleed. My grandmother's couch comes to mind from when I was very young. But today's story is about a place where it might not be safe to bleed. So let's learn a little bit more about this tale from Cranberry Stew 99 and hear about how it's not safe to bleed here. There are a few places you know where you shouldn't bleed, I'm sure. Shark-infested waters, anywhere in bear country, and in polite company. Sure, but you're forgetting the Midwest. It's pretty much bred into us, even though we don't see it directly when growing up. You come back inside for dinner when the bell rings, or Mom screams bloody murder over whatever game you're playing in the woods or the corn. If your parents are generous, you can go out after dark and catch fireflies. But make sure you wear your shoes. Don't go too close to the woods, or a branch might poke your eye out. All that sort of talk. What they don't tell you, or even usually know in earnest, is that you shouldn't bleed after dark. It's not the predators, mind you. The worst we have here are coyotes, and they're usually more afraid of you than you are of them. Usually, there's a few examples of kids being ripped apart by then, but those rarely reach the news because something else is actually to blame. A satanic ritual where the kids rip the child in question apart, while their own tears stream in fat rivulets, while their friends screamed for mercy and their parents listened horrified, but understandingly from a balcony not a quarter-mile away. The parents never blamed the children for what they had done to survive in this place. Something made them know that it had to be done. You see, the land once belonged to the natives. They walked this land and knew its habits and its hungers. They knew how to appease it, how to placate it long enough so that its hunger wouldn't consume them whole. The white men came barreling in here thinking they knew how to appease it, and ironically, we accidentally did. Pig farms, you see, generate a lot of blood. blood that must be drained, and this blood might as well be processed into fertilizer. This blood placates the soil here, which hungers for a blood of any type. It's a good source of nitrogen, some farmers say, but the old farmers, more gristle than muscle, remember what it really is. It's a sacrifice to the land. So, let me tell you a story from my childhood as to why you should never bleed after dark in the Midwest. I was 13, my cousin Zach was 14, and my friend was about the same age. My mom let us go collect fireflies after dark, which is harmless enough. The land is usually quite respectful of property, and my mother, like her mother's mother, buried those witch bottles filled with piss after childbirth, with nails and broken glass around the edges of the property to demarcate the family domain. It's hollowed the ground, though our ignorant children's minds didn't register her declaration that we were only safe on family property. My cousin Zach was the one to dare us into the field beyond the farm. I knew better, or at least I should have, but after a triple dog dare, the most sacred of all dares, I went first into the cutting dry corn husks of late September. I felt them scratch me as I ran into the forest of uniform corn stalks. Despite the minuscule pain, I giggled, knowing that I was breaking one of my mother's biggest rules: do not enter the cornfield after dark, or you'll get lost. I was a smart kid, and I knew this because everyone told me so I figured I could find my way back. The moon was high, and if I just headed away from it, then I'd be fine. I heard my friends come charging in behind me, laughing and scrambling through the razor-sharp corn, but not quite behind me. I looked down at my arms and saw tiny, slightly bloody scratches along them, and could only imagine that I had them on my shins and face as well. The worst cut was on my left outside wrist, and I caught the sight of the first rivulet of blood falling, almost in slow motion, as it fell to the dry and thirsty soil below me. Even in the moonlight, I could see that was where the blood had hit the soil, cratering it. The soil around it darkened dramatically, as if I poured a bottle of water into it, and the soil, the best I can describe it, is that it drank me in. It knew me now. My blood ran cold, and I shouted out to my friends and to Zach that I thought we should leave. As the purple vines began spilling up from that first drop, it became an existential fear in me. I bolted back the way I'd come. I know I was only a dozen rows or so inside the field, but as I ran and ran, I quickly became aware that either I was running in the wrong direction, or that suddenly direction was meaningless. The soil had tasted my blood, and it would have me. I'll spare you the details, but give you the highlights and let you fill in the rest. I'm sure that whatever you imagine is only half as awful as what I saw that night. First, I came across Zach. He was bleeding all over from faint scratches that bled more than they had any right to do, and I knew that the land would never let him leave. He had stripped off his bloody long-sleeve shirt to inspect where exactly he was bleeding from. He was more perplexed than anything, and obliviously told me that I had lost the game of hide-and-seek, since he was the seeker. I put on his blood-soaked shirt and sprinted through the corn, the sound of him screaming to come back here in anger, followed by the shrieking pain he must have felt as the husk ripped his skin from him with every step. It'll haunt me forever. Despite himself, he couldn't help but follow the blood on his shirt until every piece of him was skinned away by the blades we ran through. Next, my best friend. I keep his name a secret so as to keep him safe, but I found him digging a hole to escape the sharp edges around him. I told him to stop digging because the very soil below him wanted him. That's what my mom used to say, anyway. He curled into a ball, afraid to move an inch, lest one of the stalks come closer to him. I told him I'd get help and to stay as still as he could. Lastly, I saw a glowing flame. I ran towards it, my cousin's long-sleeve shirt protecting me from the lashing leaves and jagged soil when I tripped. Blood still dripped from painless razor cuts all across me, but not as badly as Zach. When I arrived, my mom was already gone. She sat there on her knees, holding something I can only hope was not a baby, smoldering amidst a circle of burning corn stalks that seemed to never run out of fuel. My throat was choked with the scent of my mother's burning hair, and my eyes streamed with both the smoke and my abysmal feeling of loss and loneliness. I ran, and I woke my father when I broke through the forest of corn, screaming bloody murder. My mother was dead, my cousin was bleeding, my best friend was hiding in a hole. At the end of it, my mother was proclaimed missing, though everyone in town showed it in their eyes that they both pitied me and respected my mother's sacrifice. My best friend was committed to an institute for a while, and we fell apart, but he lived. My cousin, on the other hand, was, according to the news, ripped apart by coyotes. So, thus the whole county went hunting for coyotes, shooting them dead, burning them, leaving them to rot. Do you see what I mean? Zach and my mother were only pawns in the end. The land got the blood of 1,000 coyotes out of this little adventure, but one problem remains. Despite my mother's knowledge of the old ways, the land remembers my taste. I was driving back home to see my dad after years away from this awful place. I hit a pothole the size of Kansas that took my front tire clean off. My phone calls and texts won't go through. My phone's been at 23% for entirely too long. It has easily been days, but nothing has changed. The sky is still black. The moon is the same as it had been when I left years ago. The clock hasn't moved an inch, but I know only how long it's been because of sleep, hunger, and thirst. I have a middling understanding of tech, and I've wrote a script to post this message once my laptop gets signal again. The corn grows so close to these roads, and only seems to grow closer the further down the road I look. It will know my taste again. I'm coming, Zach. If you get this message, friend, know that this country knows your taste, and you are more than welcome to come here and feed it. Run away to the desert. It's not safe to bleed here.
One more story for you, and then I think that'll do it for today. But don't worry, I've saved you a good one for last. I've always liked the idea of urban exploring. You know, I'm not quite brave or foolhardy enough to do it myself, but it seems really cool. But you've gotta be careful what you stumble across while you're out exploring. Otherwise, you might find something you're unprepared for. So let's hear about one of those times when somebody stumbled across the Ratman. Read by our own Spike 1117.
I work as a part-time contractor, specializing in flooring. It's good, fulfilling work for the most part. I learned the trade from my cousin, and it supplements my day trading income. I've been doing it for a few years now, and while I enjoy it, I'm sure my work stories would bore the average person. That was until a few months ago. I had a job just on the outskirts of town, a large but pretty old house that had recently been bought by new owners that wanted to renovate the basement, which had never been fully finished by the previous guy who owned it. We had been working for a while, and things were going pretty normally. We were working to remove the previously decrepit flooring. I was chiseling in the far corner of the room when suddenly the ground under me just kind of collapsed. Before I even knew what was happening, I was splayed out in the dark, pain screeching across my body as my head pounded. I was covered in debris and laid out stunned, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. One of the other contractors peered over the edge at me, asking if I was all right. He was roughly 3 feet above me, looking down into the hole. I slowly sat up, and while I was pretty torn up, I wasn't seriously injured or anything. I told him I was all right and had a look around. I noticed I was in some kind of tunnel. To my right and left, the dirt path drifted off into the darkness. After I'd been pulled out and cleaned up a little, I told the other workers what I had seen. As far as we knew from the blueprints of the house, there was no underground chambers or anything under the basement we should have been aware of, other than the usual plumbing and electrical stuff. We halted the job and contacted the previous owner, who knew nothing about any tunnels below the house. We filed a report with the city, given that we were literally out of our depth and had no idea how to approach a situation. They told us they'd investigate, and for the time being, we weren't to continue work on the property. A few days later, we were contacted and told that because of the danger of the site, the new owners had been compensated, and the city had taken ownership of the property and condemned it. We were paid for our work, plus a little extra for the trouble, and that was that. The other guys were content, but I have to admit my curiosity was piqued. Like I said, this field isn't exactly known for excitement outside of the industry, but nothing like this had ever happened to me or anyone else I knew. I mean, secret underground tunnels. That's the stuff that a good mystery's made out of. I decided to talk about it to the local paper, and at the very least, I thought it could give me a minute or two in the spotlight. Who doesn't want to be on the news, right? I met with one of the journalists and told my story. She grabbed some pictures of my scabs and told me I was almost guaranteed to be featured. It's a small town, and not much happens around here. I figured I'd at least get a blurb on their online publication or something. Instead, the next day I got an email from them saying that unfortunately they had to reject my submission. I was a little stung, honestly, but I didn't take it too harshly. Not like it was going to be life-changing or anything like that. It wasn't a half hour later that I received a knock on my door. I opened the door to a short but well-built man. He was wearing a fairly plain button-up, a jacket, and some jeans, nothing out of the ordinary. He asked if he could come in, and he said he was from the city. I agreed, and we went and sat in my living room. I'll make this short. I don't want to waste your time. The city is asking you to keep the incident at the property and hillside to yourself. We're investigating things thoroughly, and we do not want to cause any alarm to residents or attract any vandals or urban explorers. I was taken aback, since while I was curious, I didn't think it was as big a deal as all that. I agreed nonetheless, not wanting any real trouble. I did let him know that I'd contacted the local paper, but they rejected my story anyway. "We know," he said, and his cordial demeanor turned suddenly grim. He stood up and turned ever so slightly so I could get a look at the holstered gun on his hip. "Don't do that again. Are we clear?" My blood ran cold, and I affirmed that we were. He nodded and told me to have a good day before he left. I was stunned. I didn't know what the hell had just happened. As I was reasoning through things, I figured no legitimate city personnel would threaten me with a gun. I mean, he wasn't a cop, but who would care so much about this, or even know about it? How did they know I was talking to a journalist? Over the next few days, it ate me up. Apparently the other guys had similar experiences with someone from the city, though not as drastic as mine. Most of them figured we had run into something we shouldn't have, and we should just leave it alone. One, though, Raphael, seemed even more interested than I was. I'd worked with him on a few projects before, and he was a little quirky, to say the least. He called me privately and proposed that we investigate the site ourselves. I turned him down. After all, someone had enough interest in the situation to follow me and flash me his gun, supposedly on behalf of the city. Raph said that he would go with or without somebody, but I told him even if I wanted to go with him, there was no way we could go back into it. The house, I'm sure, was being watched, and city workers were taking care of the tunnels. Wasn't like we were equipped to go excavating all over the area the house was on. He dropped in for a while, confronting me with sound logic. It was only a few days later that he sent me a picture of an open hole taken at some hill. Found this kind of close. Going to investigate. Text you when I'm out, the message read. A pit grew in my stomach. Surely whatever was going on was far above our heads, and he was taking a big risk being nosy. I figured he'd get caught, and I'd get another visit asking if I knew about what he was doing. Part of me also worried that he would get physically hurt, though, or even lost. What if they sealed him up in there? Or what if a tunnel collapsed? My fear grew over the next few days as I didn't hear anything from him. I began to worry more and more, and I thought about calling the police, but there was that curiosity creeping back in. Morbid, gnawing curiosity. Strange sense that the police in this situation would not be my friends. I figured I should at least find the spot he went to let the authorities know, you know. Early the next morning, I drove out to the area. There were quite a few hiking trails, so I gathered and started on one of those as I made my way around until I found the hole. My heart dropped when I saw his car parked in one of the lots, with 3 tickets piled mindlessly on the windshield. I started on the closest path, trying to find the spot he had sent a picture from. It was clear from his photo that he'd gone off trail, but I was hoping to at least get an idea of where exactly he'd headed. After roughly 20 minutes of wandering around, I saw a hill that looked like it could be it in the distance. I made for it as quickly as possible, sweating up a storm. I cursed the fact that I'd only brought a single bottle of water as I slammed it down my dry throat. Eventually, I reached the hill and began to circle it. It didn't take me long to find the hole. I froze at its entrance, staring down at it. It was roughly the height of the chamber that I'd landed in when I originally had my accident. Call the police, I told myself, but I didn't. The gaping maw in front of me seemed to pull me in. Why I climbed in, I couldn't tell you. Fear for Raph, knowing a minute wasted could be the difference between life and death. Fear of what would happen to me if the authorities got involved. And irrational desire to uncover the truth all by myself. Whatever the reason, I climbed in and started down the slowly dropping shaft. I hadn't prepared at all. I had my phone flashlight, which poorly illuminated the chamber. I slowly inched my way down, stopping every now and again to listen for anything. All I could hear was my own breathing. I continued before calling out, "Raph, it's me! Raph, you down here?" No reply. I knew this had to be a long tunnel, impossibly long. The house was a solid 3-minute drive from the recreational area. That might not sound like much, but when you're crawling in a tunnel, it sure as hell is. I resolved that if I didn't find any trace of him in the next few minutes, I would turn around and bite the bullet with the cops. Not long after that, I saw an opening in the wall. It was another tunnel, shooting down left. Right next to the new hole, I saw something etched in the dirt, a crude arrow pointing up, and some letters next to it. They were pretty hard to read, and I pressed my face and phone light real close. The scrawlings were faint and jagged, but this is what I could make out. In something ST1 something. I pondered for a second on what it might mean. Was it graffiti? I hadn't even noticed something was now in the opening. A rat's face peeking out of the darkness. I jumped back and yelped, slamming into the chamber wall. I caught my breath. I've seen a few rats in my day, and I've never really been scared of them. I shined the light at it, ready to tell it to go away. My stomach dropped, and my adrenaline flooded my body a second time. It wasn't a rat. It was rat-like, covered in fur and whiskers, with huge ears and a protruding snout. But it was nearly man-sized. It wore a ragged vest and tattered camo pants. In one hand it held a rusted revolver, pointed straight at me. Between its teeth, it clenched a long blade. I said nothing. I was paralyzed with fear, but its free hand had begun to motion me to come closer. and it turned to point down the chamber. I saw a long, fleshy tail below its legs as it shifted. It pulled the knife from its mouth and began to speak at me. It was at once guttural and squeaky, but it was clearly English. "Come, I bring you to Major." I began to stammer, protesting and putting my hands up, my phone light clattering to the ground and shining up. No, I'm sorry, I'll leave, please." As I pleaded, it began to inch towards me, nostrils flaring. In retrospect, it must have wanted me alive. Otherwise, it would have just shot me. I heard something coming down the way I had come. Glancing, I saw another shape inching towards me. I thought it might be a second one of them. Suddenly, a bright beam of light flooded the chamber, and I shielded my eyes. The creature let out a terrible shriek, and I could hear the sound of scurrying. A deafening boom followed a gunshot, which my ears had yet to recover from. I felt hands grab me and pull me back up the tunnel a ways. I looked up and saw it was a human man. He let go of me for a second, and with great speed, he withdrew, primed, and threw a canister down the tunnel, which started spewing some sort of gas. Instantly my eyes began to sting, and he screamed at me to follow him out, roughly pulling me forward. I crawled blindly after him, repeatedly scraping myself and hitting my head in a panic. Eventually we burst out of the tunnel and into the sun. I laid sprawled on the ground, everything in pain. My eyes, my ears, my lungs, my hands, my knees. They were all searing. Through blurred eyes, I saw the man intently looking down the chamber, a pistol of his own pointed down. I recognized him as the man from the city that had threatened me at the start of all this. After what seemed like forever, he put the gun away and came to me. He asked if I was injured, and I shook my head. He helped me up, and we walked a ways from the opening, but also away from the trail. He sat me down and began to yell. "I thought I was clear that you were going to drop it," he said, burying his face in his hands. "I messed up. I should have trailed you longer. I thought you were done with this." I said nothing, and he turned to me with an intense look on his face. "Why were you out here? And who knew you were here?" My friend, my work buddy, Raph, he went down there. I hadn't heard from him. He worked with me at the job." His face went pale. "He went down there? I thought that guy was going to be less problematic. This is bad. This is really bad." He took a deep breath, and after a moment of collecting himself, he spoke. "Forget about him. Forget you ever knew him. No, to hell with that. I'm already screwed. My superiors are going to crucify me. I'll tell you this. Forget everything. Your job, your apartment, anything you have here. Get the hell out of the country, and don't tell anyone where you're going, because I'm sure I'll have to testify. Don't ever speak of what you saw. I'm not saying this to cover my ass. I'm as good as dead, but if you want any chance of having a normal life after this, go somewhere quiet. Start fresh. Leave this all behind you, and do it quick." He stopped talking and pulled out a radio. He fiercely pointed towards the trail, and I didn't hesitate. I went all the way back, hopping into my car, and drove straight home. I sat for a while, stunned, before slowly grabbing some important things. My cousin Dave had a place down in Mexico, a majority of the year. Although I lost my personal phone, I still had my work phone, and I got a hold of him. I didn't tell him much, just that I was in trouble, and I needed to get down there as quickly as possible to figure out my situation. After he verified that I hadn't killed anyone or anything like that, he agreed to help me make arrangements to get out of here. I won't go into much detail, but I more or less fled without a word, taking only money and my passport, alongside some clothes and stuff. I eventually got down to his place, a quiet little spot in a small resort town. He put me up for a while and also helped me make a game plan for my next move. Of course, he wanted to hear what happened. I told him everything over a couple of drinks. When I finished, he swished the glass for a second, thinking hard. "You remember my dad, right?" he eventually asked. I nodded. I hadn't known my uncle too well, and he had a reputation in the family for being kind of a kook and a recluse. He'd been in the army during the Vietnam War, being dishonorably discharged, got into a lot of conspiracy nonsense, and ended up being divorced by my aunt when I was young. He more or less disappeared after that. Really never saw his kids or anyone else in the family. You see, my dad, most of the stuff he got into was crackpot garbage, but there was one thing he always raved about that he swore he had personally seen evidence of. You know, the abandoned factory outside the city. Everyone in the area did. It was no secret for locals that in the 60s, the U.S. Army had requisitioned the facility as a testing ground for demolitions, and after the Vietnam War, they packed up and left it abandoned. My uncle had been a desk jockey at the facility and was discharged for mentally unstable behavior. Dad was convinced that there was more than demolition going on out there when he was in the Army. He claimed that he did some snooping around and discovered that the demolition thing was a cover-up for secret projects. He took a deep breath and laughed, a little shaky in his face. This is going to sound silly. Actually, no, it's not. Not after what you told me. He thought they were trying to breed some kind of super soldier there to use in Nam. He was part of logistics and said they were always discreetly bringing in all kinds of lab equipment alongside the normal stuff. There was one shipment he caught a glimpse of, and said there was a bunch of pet supplies for rats. He got this idea that the Army was attempting to splice rodent DNA into troops. You know, because of all the Viet Cong tunnel systems and the tunnel rats. He thought they were trying to take it a step further, literally making soldiers with rat DNA to infiltrate the tunnels. The story was that when he tried to bring things up, they dismissed him, till he attempted to expose things himself and got himself caught and discharged on a faulty psychological ground. Given how he was, we always figured he was kind of crazy, and that they were probably in the right. We both sat in silence for a little while, and strangely started to laugh. Guess he wasn't so crazy after all, then. Once I got set up, things were okay for a while. I found ways to apply my skill set to my new area and work jobs to get by. No government men came after me, and I had more or less made it out, free and clear. Why am I posting then? Well, I'm not sure. Just like my decision to enter the tunnels, it's undercut by that lingering sense of curiosity. I can't say I want to be found, but I almost do. It's lonely, and I've got no one to share this experience with out here. I'm wondering what all ended up happening. My life is kind of dead end now, working just to pay for the basics. How do you go back to normalcy after something like that? I'm sure this will end up across somebody's radar. I don't know if I'll end up with a bullet in my head in the middle of the night, or me taken to some kind of secret interrogation facility or what. But I feel compelled to share, and I accept whatever fate is coming my way.
And just like that, it sounds like the rain is starting to stop. So I guess it's time for our stories to take a break for another day. Don't be too sad, though. I'll be back again very soon with more cozy horror and more of me, Dr. Plague. Until then, have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.